Alright, so here we are in exercise 15. So this is the exercise where we explore going from Adobe Illustrator into Adobe Photoshop and then utilizing Adobe Photoshop for its texture and painting tools. So if you want to give more life to, let's say, a vector illustration, Photoshop is the way to go. So when you bring it into Photoshop, that's when you can utilize the power of things like texture brushes and photo textures that are usually a little bit more tedious to use in Adobe Illustrator. But just know that when you do bring a file from Illustrator into Photoshop, you're going to permanently change it into a raster-based file. So that means it's going to be made up of pixels instead of editable vector paths. With this exercise, you guys should have gotten the native AI file that we're going to save, this PDF that I'm looking at right now, and then 3 texture JPEGs that we're going to be overlaying into the illustration. So make sure you have those 4 files in this folder. So without further ado, let's open up our Illustrator file and then learn how to save it for Photoshop. And then we're going to go through and learn how to use the texture brushes, layer masks, the transparency lock, and other things regarding layer transformations and blending modes. So this is kind of like a quick reference for everything I'm going to go over. So if you guys need to pause this and look at this, feel free to do that. Okay, so here we are, and I've created a graphic illustration, a little still life, and I have all of the layers set up so that each object is on its own layer and it follows the order of foreground to background. So for instance, hey, this top bush shape, this is in the front, and then at the very end we have our mountains and our clouds and then our sky. So the background is at the very back. So this is a really common way of setting up your illustration for Illustrator before you bring it into Photoshop. Now just know that even on this bush front, I have 2 different objects here. So you can see I have this lighter area of the bush and then this darker area. It's kind of like a dual tone. And then I have this branch system behind it. I'll just do Command Z to bring that back into place. And so what we're going to do is save this and open it up in Photoshop. Now what you don't want to do is just drag this file into Photoshop, because you're not going to get some certain options that you really need in order to pull off using texture brushes and other photo textures. So what you need to do is you need to come up to File and go to Export and Export As. Okay, and we can just name this file ex15 underscore your last name. And we're not going to save this as a PNG or a portable network graphic. We're going to choose from this format list and we're going to find Photoshop PSD. And I'll make sure to save that where I know how to retrieve it. So now that I have that as a Photoshop export, I'll hit export. Okay, we'll keep the color model at RGB. The resolution we'll keep at 300 ppi or pixels per inch. Just know that we could actually save this at a higher pixel per inch, but for demo's sake, just 300 will work. And then this is the really important part. Okay, if I were to just drag this AI file into Photoshop, it would flatten all these layers and I would just be left with one image to try to work with. But what I can do here is keep this checked, right layers, and so it's going to maintain all these layers into Photoshop. Let's change the anti-aliasing to art optimized as well, and then I'll click OK. Alright, so now that I have this file saved as a PSD, I can just right click and open it in Photoshop. I can double click it, or I can drag it onto my Photoshop shortcut on the desktop. Whatever computer system you're working with, open it in Photoshop. Okay, so here we are in Photoshop, and we have a layout that's very similar to Illustrator. So we have a application menu here at the top. Right below that, we have the control bar. So we know that this changes depending on the panel and the tools that we're using. We have a toolbar here on the left. We have our panel dock over here. And some of you guys might have a timeline window down here. I'm going to go ahead and just close this one so that I just have the basic setup. All right, and the other thing I want you guys to pay attention to is the layers. So I'll click on layers here in the panel dock, or you can go to window and layers. And notice we have all of the layers that we had in the Illustrator file. Some of these layers have actually been turned into groups. So if I click on this right facing arrow, I'm going to untoggle that group and see that this wall group contains all the paths that I need. Same with the floor. And so this is what we need to effectively work here in Photoshop and get the correct masking options for all of this. Alright, so now that we've explored looking over the layers, let's go ahead and dive in and start using the brushes. So I'm going to come over here to the brush panel in the panel dock. I can also go to window and brush. I'll click on that. And before I can start using this panel, I have to have my brush tool. So I can hit B for the brush tool, or I can come over here to the tool panel and grab that. Alright, so this is one of the big strengths of using Photoshop, is using this brush tool. So right now we're just using a standard tip brush. Okay, so up here are all the what's called the brush presets. So I could kind of go through and you get a preview of what that brush is going to look like. So these are all kind of like standard brushes. There's these pencil brushes, and everyone might have some different variations on the brushes, but most likely everyone has these splatter brushes. Now they're called splatter, but they actually have a lot of real painting brush qualities in the sense of as you use this brush, it's going to make what looks like an actual brush stroke. So I'll just test this out real quick. I'm using black. You can see that right here in the fill. I'll hit the right bracket key to increase the size. I can also do that from right here in the panel. Let's go ahead and drag down, see what that gives me. So you can see it has a little vignette on the end. I'll hit Command Z. Now in Photoshop, when you need to undo, the first time that you need to undo something is Command Z, but the second time you need to undo, you need to hold down Command and Alt and then Z. Okay, so the other thing I can do with this brush is I can adjust the tip shape. So right here I can squash this. I'll increase the size. So now I have more of a calligraphic brush. I'll do Command Z, Command Alt Z. I can change the angle on that. I can also change what's called the spacing. So this is the space that the computer puts in between each one of these like stamped silhouettes of the brush tip. So if I increase the spacing and then I use the brush, now we're getting more of the silhouette that we were previewing here in the brush panel. I'll do Command Z a few times just to keep practicing with that. Command Alt and Z and get rid of all those. I'll go back up to the top of the preset, so up in here, and just grab one of my standard brushes. And right now we're working with a full hardness. So the hardness refers to the edges of the brush. So I'll go ahead and increase the size and show you at full hardness as I paint. I'm just getting that hard edge. Do Command Z on that. If I bring this down all the way, you can see in the preview that it's blurring or feathering the edges. So that's what hardness is going to do for your brush. By the way, a lot of these same options are found right up here in the control bar. Okay, there's so many other things we can do with the brush tool, but for this exercise, we're not going to go through all of these. I'll just point your attention to the fact that we've just been working with what's called brush tip shape, but we can also work with things like shape dynamics. So we can randomize the size of our brush, the diameter, the angle, the roundness, and these can all be controlled by the pen pressure of your drawing tablet too. We can scatter the brush around. We can add even another texture to the brush. We can change how it colors things and so many other things. But for now, I'm just going to make sure that I'm just working with the brush tip shape. And I'll go ahead and find one of these splatter brushes. Let me find this 46. So if you can, try to find one of the splatters. It looks like a round paint splatter. All right, now that I have that selected, I'm going to increase the spacing on that to about 95, and then I'll hit the right bracket key to increase the size. So now I have my brush ready, but I need to choose what layer I'm going to work on. So I'll go ahead and come back to the panel dock and choose layers. And yes, I want to work with the brush front, but right up here is some options for working on these layers. What I want to do when I work on this bush is I want to make sure my paint strokes only affect the pixels of that bush. I don't want my paint to get into the sky or the mountains or anything else. So in order to do that, I can click on this icon right here. It's called the transparency lock, or it says lock transparent pixels. So if I click that, I'm gonna be able to paint on here and not affect the other layers. I'll demo that real quick. I'm holding down on the mouse and you can see that's only affecting that layer. I'll go ahead and do Command Z. And just for safekeeping, I'm gonna lock some of these other layers. So right here, this pot and branch, and then I'm gonna hit the lock button right here. This is very similar to Illustrator. And I'll just go through and lock all these other ones that I'm not using. And since I'm using the bush front, I'm going to make sure that I have that lock off and that I have the transparent pixel lock on. So this little checkerboard. Okay, so now that I've locked those transparent pixels, I'm going to hold down on the Alt key to access my eyedropper, and I'm going to select this color value right here. And you can see that shows up right over here in my color picker, so right down over here. I'll double click on that, and I'll go ahead and choose a lighter value, maybe with a little bit more yellow. And then there's one more thing I'm going to do. Right up here in your control panel, you can adjust how much of the color pigment comes out of your brush, or how opaque or transparent those pixels are. I'm going to go ahead and lower this down a little bit, bring the flow down to 48, and then I'm going to take the brush and just kind of dust over this edge of the bush shape and see what happens. Okay, you can see it's slowly lightening that up, and maybe in this case I want the bottom part to be lighter. I'm going to go ahead and decrease the size of that brush and just get some strokes going on right over here down at the bottom. If you're using your drawing tablet and you have your brush set to pen pressure, so if you go into your brush panel and you go to transfer, you want to change your opacity to pen pressure and your flow to pen pressure instead of off. Because I'm using a mouse, I'm just going to uncheck that and go back to my layers. Alright, so now that I've added more of a highlight to my bush, I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit of a dark edge on this side. So I'll hold down on the Alt key, click on that, double click on the color picker, and then move this down. I'll even move it a little bit more into the blue color spectrum, and then I'll start to dust my brush tool along this edge. Okay, maybe I'll even get a little bit darker than that. And because I'm using a lower flow, it's not putting so much of the dark pixels down right away, kind of gradually putting them on there. This is one of the really cool things about using Photoshop, is having that ability. I'm waiting until I get kind of a good color contrast on there, and that looks pretty good. Alright, so I'll go ahead and click on the bush back layer right over here. I'll go ahead and unlock that and then click the transparency lock. I'm going to sample some of these colors, double click on my color picker and move down in value, and then I'll come to the inside of this and give it a little bit more of a value change. Alright, let's try the pot and branch. So right here, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that it's unlocked. And when I do that, I'll see a hollow icon for the lock. I'll make sure the transparency lock is on. You can see that right there. I'll zoom in a little bit. And I'm going to sample this value, holding down the Alt key. We'll go ahead and decrease the size of that. And instead of painting right away, I'm actually going to add a new layer on top of that. So with that pot branch selected, I'm going to come down here into the layer panel and add a new layer. But I want to still make sure that I am just painting on these pixels and not going over those. So what I need to do is I need to hover over layer 1 that I just created. I'm going to hold down on the Alt key and then get close to the edge of these two layers. And as I do that, I'm going to get this icon. So it's a downward facing arrow with a square next to it. So I'm going to click on that, and now it's showing me layer 1 goes into pot and branch layer. This is a clipping mask. So whatever I do in this layer 1, it's going to stay within the bounds of the pot and branch. So let's give that a try. So I'll start painting on this edge right here. And I think I'm going to bring down the spacing a little bit on this brush. So I'll bring spacing down. All right. And I'm just trying to get this edge to look a little more diffused. I could even select this color with my eyedropper, and I could push some of this color back into it, kind of like this. Alright, so I like that, but I don't like how the brush has come over here and kind of flooded this area. But since it's on its own layer, I can actually grab my eraser tool. So I'll come right over here, or you can hit E for the eraser, and I'll just use the eraser and erase out some of these other brush marks that I just made with this tool. Alright, so I kind of fixed that edge, and because it's on a clipping mask, this edge is already set. At this point, I'd save this. I'm going to go File, Save As, and just make sure it's exercise 15 underscore your last name. Alright, let's come down here to this one where it just says bush. This one is referring to this object here in back, this bush. So I'll unlock that layer and lock the transparency. I'll zoom in, and let's add some color values to this one. So I'll hit B for brush, I'll hold down on my Alt key and select that color. I'll double click the color picker and move this up in color value, and now I'll begin to give some lighting to that edge. This time I'm going to use a pretty big brush like this and see what kind of effect I can get. Alright, now hold down on the Alt key and select that mid-tone color again. Double click the color picker and go down. And now I will give it some shadow tones here at the bottom. Pretty cool. I'll zoom out. Alright, and we're already getting a lot more life to this illustration. Alright, so let's give a little bit of color to the background of these mountains. And so I'm going to come back to my brushes panel, and I am going to use the same brush, but I'm going to change the brush tip. I'm going to flatten this a little bit. And I can see right here, the computer is randomizing the rotation. So I'm going to come over here to shape dynamics, and I'm just going to turn that off. If you're using a tablet, make sure to have the what's called the angle jitter on the off position. Turn that off. I'll come back to the brush tip shape. Alright, so now I have a flat brush, and I'm going to sample this purple. I'll double click the color picker, and I'll move this into the green spectrum. I'm going to go down to more of a yellowish green, and I'll increase the value and saturation, bring it up to here. I'll go back to my layers, find the mountains. I'll unlock the mountains and then lock the transparency. Actually, I gotta toggle open this group and actually find this one, because there's two objects. There's this big one and then there's a small one here. I'll choose this one, lock the transparency, and now I'll increase the size of the brush. And now I'll actually come up here to the control panel and bring down the opacity. So it's similar to flow, but a little bit different. So I'm just kind of slowly adding in what is kind of a grass texture. I think I'll drop the opacity even more, and I'll drop the flow. I'll decrease the size of the brush, and I'm just kind of dusting these edges. Maybe that's a little too low. I'll bring that up by just about 30%. I'll increase the size, and I'll see if I can sneak this green up the mountain a little bit. I like this effect I'm getting. It's kind of like this graduated green grass going up the hill. I'm going to actually go back into the color picker and find a desaturated low value, and I'll increase the opacity and flow. And I'm just going to kind of carefully put this in just to kind of break this up a little bit. Maybe I'll change the brush tip to be even flatter. Just kind of add that in a little bit. I want enough contrast with this bush here. Okay. So I'm going to go back to my layers. I'm going to go ahead and just lock that one, and I'll toggle close the mountains group. Let's work with another feature. So I need to find the clouds, which are right here. I'm going to unlock the clouds, and instead of doing a transparency lock, I'm going to come right down here to this icon. This is called a layer mask. So I'm going to click on that. This is almost identical to an opacity mask in Illustrator. So when I use this, by default, it gives me black and white. So if you can remember from the opacity masks, that white reveals and black conceals. So what I want to do is I want to come in here and I want to kind of break up these cloud edges so they're not so sharp, and maybe add some other little subtle details in here. So essentially I kind of want to erase away some of the clouds, but I don't want to use my eraser tool because I want to be able to kind of reverse any kind of thing that I erase. I want it to be editable. So I'm going to come right over here and I'm going to switch the black and the white. You can also hit the X key. I'm going to bring up the opacity and I'll keep the flow a little bit lower. And now I'm going to make my brush a little bit smaller, and I'm just going to touch these edges of the cloud and see what it does. So I'll zoom in a little bit. You can see we are getting a softer edge. I'm going to actually bring down the opacity a little bit more so it's not so hard edge when I chop into this. Now if you look down right here in this little mask window, it shows us where we are painting or where we're masking off those colors. We're basically erasing them away. If I wanted to, I could hit the X and go back to white, and I could reveal everything that I just erased away. I can hit the X key again and start concealing these parts. So this is a really cool feature when you're using Photoshop, being able to mask parts away, bring parts back that you might have erased or masked off too much. Maybe I'll put a hole in this cloud right here, and I know that I can always bring these parts back if I need to. I'm going to decrease the size, hit the X button, and bring a little bit more of this cloud back, a little more variation in that. Alright, I'll come down here and I'll do this part of the clouds. This time I'll increase the size. And you can click, or you can do some clicking and dragging, see what kind of effect that it gives the mask. So I like that, but maybe a little too much on this top end. So I'll hit the X key and bring some of that back. Zoom out. So you can see that subtle transition, just giving it more of a convincing look to it while still having this stylized overall illustration. And I think while we're at it, I'm going to mask off just a little bit of this shadow coming off of the pot. So I'm going to go ahead and lock this layer here, and then I'll come over to the floor. I'll toggle that open. You can see we have the floor path, and then we have the shadows associated with it. I'm going to go ahead and choose the floor group and unlock it so I can work with it. And then I'm going to choose that shadow path. Okay, so it's the one in the middle. I'll put a layer mask on there, and this time I'll bring my opacity down pretty low. I want a subtle gradation in there. I'll switch the black and the white so my black is active. I'll just come in here and I'll start to dust this edge a little bit and just soften that transition a little bit. Make this a little bit smaller. I want this to be a little bit more faint. Zoom out a little bit. So it's as though we're adding a light value to this shadow, but what we're actually doing is just erasing some of it away and revealing the floor beneath it. All right, so I like that. So at this point, it looks like we could start adding some texture to the floor and to some other things here in the illustration. So let's learn how to do that. Okay, so in the folder for exercise 15, you guys should have 3 of these photo textures. We have a carpet texture, we have grain, and we have wood planks. Go ahead and select all of those and then open them with Photoshop. All right, and I'm going to hit V to access the black arrow just like in Illustrator. So what we need to do is we need to select each one of these textures and then bring them into our file. So up here we can see we have tabs. These are all the different files that are open right now. So let's go ahead and start with this wood planks. So I want to bring this texture into this file here. So what I'm going to do is with this file open, I'm going to hit Command and A to select all, and make sure you're working with your black arrow. Now if I hover inside of that shape, I'm getting the arrow with a pair of scissors. So that means it's ready to cut and move this selection wherever I want to put it. So I'm going to click and hold down, and I'm going to drag this up, and I'm going to hover onto that tab of exercise 15. I haven't let go of the mouse. I'm going to drag back down about to where I want this to be, and then release the mouse. And so we brought in this texture, and look at this. It's right here on its own layer. Let's go ahead and double click that layer on the name and rename it Wood Planks. And I'm going to toggle open the floor layer and move this down into that group. So I'm clicking and holding, and I just dragged that wood planks right on top of this path down here, the big floor path. Now I'm going to embed the wood planks within the pixels of this path. So I'm essentially going to make a clipping mask. So what we're going to do is, while wood planks is selected, we're going to hold down on the Alt key, hover close in between the wood planks and that floor path so we get this symbol, and then click once, and then release, and now we can see the wood planks is now contained within the pixels of that floor path. There we go. All right, so now that we have that inside of the floor path, let's transform it. Let's give it a look to where it seems like this whole floor is a wood deck. So with that layer selected, I'm going to hit Command and T to get my transform option. And the first thing I want to do is size this. I'm going to size this into place, and don't be fooled. When you start sizing this, you're going to get this very pixelated look to the texture. This will go away after we actually apply the transformation, so it's temporary. We know we have a high quality photo with a large PPI or pixels per inch, so we will maintain that. Okay, so now that I have that sized, I want to put a little bit of perspective on it. So I need to access a further option. I'm going to go up to the application menu and go to Edit, go down to Transform, and then I'm going to go to Distort. And with Distort on, I'm going to click these edges and start to pull this into perspective. So you can see the way that Photoshop allows you to transform an object is a lot better than how we did it in Illustrator. If you remember in Illustrator, every time we start moving one of these parts of the transformation, it would reset the object within that, and then we kind of had this like jumbled mess to work with. So this one I think is a lot easier. So I'm going to pull that over, give it a little bit of a diagonal stress. All right. So I like that. So when you like what you have, you can just hit return and you can see that now it's a really high resolution texture. Let's go ahead and change the blending mode. We want that color of the floor to show through. So with this layer selected, I don't have to open up any other panel. It's right here in the layer panel where it says normal. I can change this. So let's try multiply. Okay, not bad. Let's try some other ones. Color burn, darker color. Let's try overlay. Overlay's kind of cool. Soft light, vivid, so that's going to pull all the brights out. Let's try hard light. So I think I'm going to stick with the overlay option. I like this subtle texture it's given it, and what I'm going to do is actually decrease the opacity a little bit, and I don't want to do it too much. I think that's good, about 83. And then I'm going to change the blend mode of these shadows, because I want those shadows to kind of darken any of the other pixel information that's below it. So I'm going to change the shadow path to multiply. You can see as I did that, now you can see it goes from a light shadow area to a darker shadow area. Let's do the same thing to this cat shadow here. There, now we can see some of that texture coming through. All right, pretty cool. Let's do it again. Let's try a texture right here against this small snippet of a wall. So I'm going to go ahead and close the texture wood planks, and then I'll find carpet. I'll go ahead and do Command A, and with my black arrow selected, I'll click and drag right over to the exercise 15 tab. We'll open that, and then I'll drag it back down in. All right, and so what it did is actually put it inside my floor layer. I'm going to click and drag this layer up in between the floor and wall, and then I'm going to toggle open the wall, and then I'll drag this into that group. So I should have something like this. So now that it's in the wall group, I'm going to make it a clipping mask of this right here. You can see a little preview of the object of the wall with that brownish color. I'll hold down on the Alt key, and I made it a clipping mask. So it should look like this. Then I'll transform it, Command T. So before I do that transformation, I need to unlock the wall group. I'll select layer 2 and rename it carpet, and I'll go ahead and transform that. So with that layer selected, I'll hit Command and T, and it gives you a preview of how far this texture actually comes out. Let's go ahead and shrink it and make this pretty small or something like that. And just by accident, we have the dark side right here and the light side over here, and that's what we wanted. Let's go ahead and hit enter, because that's all we need to do. Now I'll change the blending mode. Yep, I think multiply is going to work for that one. I'll decrease the opacity, and that's good. All right, let's do one more. So I'll close this texture file, and we actually need to open up the wall group again. The path we're going to add to is this right here. I'm going to add the wood to this beam. So I'm going to click on that one. Now I'll go back to the texture grain. I'll hit Command A to get a selection, and then I'll drag this up into exercise 15 and then pull down. Release the mouse, and it automatically places that new texture on top of where the last layer was selected. I'll double click on this and I'll type in grain. I'll go ahead and make it a clipping mask of this path. So I'll hold down on the Alt key, hover in between, and click. There you can see now it's contained within those. Then I'll hit Command T, and instead of sizing it, I'm going to rotate it first. So I'll hover next to the corner and rotate this, and then I can just click inside and move it. Now I can size this up, shrink it a little bit. All right, I like that. I'll hit return, and now I can change the blending mode. So multiply is what I want for this one. And I'm not going to decrease the opacity because I think that's pretty good. All right, so I'm all done with this wall. I'll go ahead and close that group and lock it, and there you go. So this is how to work with the texture brushes in the brush panel. So remember, we have a lot of different brush presets that we can find here. We are working with these splatter brushes. You can actually go online and find quite a bit of custom made brushes if you wanted to use something else, but experiment with the ones that Photoshop provides. Also know we can change the size, the shape of the tip, its angle, how we space it. So we could turn it into like a regular oil brush, or we could maintain kind of this splattered textured feel. Okay, and then we also went through using the layer lock to contain whatever we do into those pixels on the layer. We use the layer mask, which allows you to kind of erase away parts of a layer or bring them back. And then we also worked with taking a nice high quality photo texture and bringing it into the illustration, and then we made it a clipping mask of whatever layer we wanted to have it contained in. So it's a lot of information and a lot of techniques thrown at you all at once, but give it a try in your own illustration. Towards the end of your illustration process, use some of these techniques to give a little more life to your illustration.